Would the earliest eyewitnesses of Jesus have correctly remembered the things that he did and said, or would their memories have been distorted? That's the question we're going to address in this video. If this is your first time watching, my name is Ryan Leisure. In the previous video, I made the case that the Jesus tradition in the Gospels could be traced back to the original eyewitnesses of Jesus, and that it wasn't filtered through dozens of intermediaries who corrupted the story along the line, much like the children's game of telephone. Yet, if it's true that the Gospels are the result of eyewitness testimony, do we have good reason to trust that they remembered the sayings and deeds of Jesus accurately? This is an important question because, as James Dunn tells us, what we have in the earliest retellings of what is now the synoptic tradition are the memories of the first disciples, not Jesus himself, but the remembered Jesus. In other words, when we look at the Gospels, we're not getting a direct look at Jesus himself, but an indirect look at him as he's been filtered through the memories of the original eyewitnesses. In short, we weren't there. Right? We didn't witness Jesus firsthand, and therefore we must rely on others who were the firsthand eyewitnesses and rely upon the fact that they're remembering things accurately. So again, this raises the question, did they remember the sayings and deeds of Jesus accurately, or did those memories get distorted? Memories, after all, have been demonstrated to be quite faulty at times. Numerous studies make this clear. One popular study was conducted at Emory University following the Challenger space explosion back in 1986. At the time, almost 50 freshman students were interviewed to provide details about how they heard about the explosion and what they were doing at the time. That same group of students was then interviewed again and asked the same questions 3 years later during their senior year, and none of them gave the same exact answer as they gave 3 years before. One student originally said they learned of the news in their dorm room, but when asked again 3 years later, they recalled learning of the news in a religion class. Studies like this demonstrate that our memories aren't as reliable as we think they are. Moreover, our personal experiences bear this out, don't they? For instance, can you remember what clothes you wore 10 days ago? Do you remember what you ate for lunch that day? Do you remember the conversations that you had with your spouse or your kids? Do you remember what you spent most of your time doing at work that day? Or do you remember the person that you stood in line next to at the grocery store? Do you remember what they looked like, or do you remember what they were wearing? Well, probably not. And these are just short-term memories. So what about memories from decades ago? After all, this is the situation we have with the Gospels. Even the most conservative estimates date the Gospels over 2 decades after the death of Jesus. So is it reasonable to think that the eyewitnesses would have accurately remembered all the things that he did and said after all that time? Well, according to Bart Ehrman, the answer is no. He writes, "In my view, the early Christian Gospels are so much more than historical sources. They are memories of early Christians about the one they considered to be the most important person ever to have walked the planet. Yet these memories can be recognized as distorted when seen from the perspective of historical reality." Given the tendency for humans to misremember things, especially things from decades ago, and because the Gospels contain a bunch of things that Ehrman thinks just could not have possibly happened, he concludes that the memories of the original witnesses are distorted, and therefore the Gospels contain distorted information. Well, in the rest of this video, I'm going to make the case that his view is mistaken, and that there are legitimate reasons for trusting that the original eyewitnesses would have remembered the sayings and deeds of Jesus accurately. And I'm going to give you 5 reasons why. So number 1, it was customary for students in the ancient world to memorize extensive portions of information. One of the problems with most modern memory studies is that they're directed towards contemporary memories of people in the West. Memories which everyone acknowledges are far less disciplined than those from the ancient Mediterranean world. Even going back just one generation, it's obvious that a disciplined memory is far less important than it was, say, 30 years ago. Because we have all the information in the world at our fingertips, we're no longer required to exercise our memory muscles for much of the information that we need on a daily basis. We can just Google it. Easy access to Scripture on our phones has decreased Scripture memory amongst Christians. Having contact information in our phones has decreased the amount of phone numbers that we know by heart. As a kid 30 years ago, I had several phone numbers memorized, and I still have many of them memorized due to how many times I dialed them. But now, I only have one phone number from my contact list memorized, and that's my wife's. You see, due to the rise in technology and accessible information, our memories have atrophied over time. We just don't memorize things like people used to because, well, frankly, we don't have to. And so it's hard for us to wrap our minds around the idea that people from the ancient world used to memorize lengthy speeches and texts and would commit them to memory. This is, after all, how they accessed that information. They couldn't just pull it up on their phone, or even in most cases, look at it in a book, because, frankly, most people didn't have books back then. If they wanted to know what Homer or Thucydides or Moses said, they would need to commit it to memory. And because they used their memory muscles much more than we do today, they had the ability to memorize lengthy speeches and texts. For example, it was not uncommon for ancient orators to memorize their entire speeches so that they could deliver them without notes, even speeches that would last for hours. It was also customary for Greek students to have Homer's Iliad and Odyssey committed to memory. In fact, the first-century orator Dio Chrysostom claims that even non-Greek speakers could recite Homer's Iliad in Greek by heart. This commitment to memory was customary in Jewish schools as well. Rabbis were known to have the entire Pentateuch memorized, and they had the same expectation for their disciples as well. Commenting on early Jewish pedagogy, Birger Gerhardsen comments, "The written Torah, when studied, is carefully committed to memory, learned by heart." He says that the material is imprinted on the student's memory through constant repetition. In addition to the written law, Jewish students would also memorize the oral law. The oral law was the unwritten law that supposedly went back to Moses at Mount Sinai that wasn't written down until around the early 3rd century in what is now called the Mishnah. Even though the oral law was quite lengthy, Gerhardsen also notes that for Jewish learners, knowing the basic text material in the oral Torah by heart is an elementary accomplishment, presupposed of every teacher and pupil at the more advanced stage. Again, I realize it's hard for us to fathom having the Pentateuch and the oral law memorized, but it's clear that it was quite normal for Jewish rabbis and students. One of the most famous passages in the Old Testament supports the idea that constant repetition and memory were very important for the Jewish culture. Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 4-7 reads, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. And these words that I command you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise." You see, ancient learning was done through constant repetition, so that important materials were imprinted on one's memory. Craig Keener is certainly correct when he remarks, "Ancient pedagogy, without a focus on memory, did not exist." And so, it's not unreasonable to think that the Rabbi Jesus would have expected his disciples to learn his teachings by heart. Material that, by the way, is only a fraction in length compared to the Pentateuch. Additionally, biblical scholars have pointed out that Jesus used certain mnemonic devices when he taught to make memorization for his students much easier. Here's Robert Stein. He says, Jesus used mnemonic devices such as parables, exaggerations, puns, metaphors and similes, proverbs, riddles, and parabolic actions to aid his disciples and audience in retaining his teaching. The fact that Jesus taught in such a way to aid the memory of his hearers means that most modern memory studies are irrelevant when it comes to thinking about how well Jesus' students would have remembered his teachings. While Jesus taught in a way that would have helped his listeners remember what he taught, most memory studies are structured in such a way so as to encourage the participant to actually misremember what happened. As Alan Kirk remarks, experiments studying memory distortion contrive to manufacture it, making use of deception, lures, and misleading questions, and the like. In one of his books, Bart Ehrman cites a memory study where a test group watched an 18-minute film on these two boys at a summer camp. After the film was over, the participants were asked a series of questions about various episodes in the film. Well, one of the questions was about an episode that wasn't in the film at all. And immediately, when the participants heard this question, they recognized that it was fraudulent and they knew that it was meant to trick them, and they pointed this out. However, 8 weeks later, the same test group was asked the same questions about the film they had watched previously. And when asked again about that same episode that was not in the film, suddenly 50% of the participants remembered it being in the film. And so thus, for Ehrman, this is just more evidence that people's memories are unreliable. Now, I don't know exactly how the questions were phrased in this particular study, but it seems to me that it was intended to trick its participants. Nobody conducts a study like this hoping that all of its participants remember correctly 8 weeks later that that episode wasn't actually in the film. No, deception is necessarily at play in a study like this and how they phrase the questions. So this study is essentially worthless when it comes to comparing it with the disciples' memories of Jesus. After all, Jesus taught in a way that would have aided his disciples' memories. So, given the early memory culture of ancient Judaism and the masterful way in which Jesus used mnemonic devices, it seems reasonable that the disciples would have remembered accurately the things that he taught them. Number 2, the disciples would have heard Jesus retell the same things over and over again. As a pastor, I can attest that the members in my church don't remember most of the sermons that I preach. And while that breaks my heart just a little bit, I don't get too upset because there's a good explanation for it. It's because I preach a different sermon every time. As a pastor, I come up with fresh material every week so as to keep my preaching from becoming stale to them. But imagine how things would be different that if instead of preaching a different sermon every week, I preached the same 5 sermons on repeat constantly. Don't you suppose that the congregation would remember those sermons quite well after hearing them dozens of times? Well, I think it's reasonable that they would. I remember in college, I worked at a Christian camp one summer. And because we had the same 2 speakers all summer long, I heard the same messages over and over again so that by the end of the summer, I knew what the speaker was going to say before he even said it. I knew when he was about to crack a joke or when he was about to raise his voice. I knew what scripture text he was about to cite or what story from his childhood that he was about to tell. And while those students who only heard those messages once and moved on the following week most likely forgot what he said, because I heard them constantly on repeat, I remembered them over the course of the summer quite well. Well, the disciples would have had a similar experience with Jesus, because Jesus wasn't a pastor creating fresh material every week. He was an itinerant preacher, traveling from village to village, teaching the same message over and over again wherever he went. The disciples who followed him around then would have heard that same message over and over and over again. They no doubt heard him tell the parable of the sower and the lost sheep dozens of times. They probably heard the greatest commandment to love God with all their heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to love their neighbor as themselves more times than they could count. It's doubtful that as an itinerant preacher, Jesus ever preached something only once or even just a couple of times. The amount of times that the disciples would have heard Jesus' message on repeat would have cemented those teachings in their brains. This is why most modern memory studies are irrelevant when it comes to thinking about Jesus' disciples. Because most memory studies are directed towards remembering a single event from a while ago. They're not directed to study people who observed the same event or heard the same thing over and over and over again. Furthermore, we must remember that Jesus didn't just teach to public crowds, but as a rabbi, he would have taught his disciples constantly in private. We see one brief example of this following Jesus telling the parable of the sower in Mark chapter 4, verse 10. We read that, "And when Jesus was alone, those around him with the 12 asked him about the parables." And then Jesus goes on to explain the meaning of that parable to them privately. And that would have been quite normal for a rabbi and his students. You see, the disciples would have heard Jesus teach publicly, but they would have heard him teach even more privately, which would have further cemented his teaching in their brains. Number 3, the disciples would have retold the sayings and deeds of Jesus over and over again. As I mentioned at the beginning of this video, we tend to forget most things, like what we ate for lunch 10 days ago, or who we stood next to in line at the grocery store. But what if, immediately after those events, we rehearsed those details to our family and to our friends every day for the next 10 days? Doesn't it seem likely that we would continue to remember those events 10 days later, since we continued to access that information, those memories, every day as we told them over and over again? Or imagine if those students who participated in the memory study at Emory University after the Challenger space shuttle explosion repeated the details of how they heard and what they were doing at the time, day after day, over the course of 3 years. Don't you suppose that they would have retained that memory 3 years later? They probably would. Well, this is the situation with Jesus' disciples. Certainly, if they hadn't given any thought to the parable of the sower or the lost sheep or the 2 greatest commandments for decades, they most likely would have forgotten them. But as disciples of a rabbi, they would have not only heard Jesus teach these things repeatedly, they would have then taught these things and said these things repeatedly on their own. As Craig Keener notes, in all schools, teaching was passed down from master to pupils, who in turn passed it on to their own pupils. And this is exactly what we see happening in the Gospels. In one particular episode, that's in all 3 of the Synoptic Gospels, Jesus sends out the 12 on mission, and he tells them to go proclaim his message in the Judean or the Galilean countrysides. Luke 9, verses 1 to 6 reports, "And he called the 12 together and gave them power and authority over all demons and to cure diseases. And he sent them out to proclaim the kingdom of God and to heal. And he said to them, 'Take nothing for your journey, no staff, nor bag, nor bread, nor money, and do not have 2 tunics. And whatever house you enter, stay there, and from there depart. And wherever they do not receive you, when you leave that town, shake off the dust from your feet as a testimony against them.' And they departed and went through the villages, preaching the gospel and healing everywhere." Now, what message do you suppose these disciples proclaimed as they traveled from village to village? As disciples of a rabbi, it's almost certain that they would simply repeat the same things they heard Jesus teach time and time again. And this practice would continue after Jesus left them till their dying breath, even as they traveled across the Roman world. In other words, it's unreasonable to think that the disciples would have put all the teachings and deeds of Jesus into the back of their brains for decades until it came time to writing the Gospels. No, their mission in the Gospels would have been the starting point of their teaching ministry that would have then continued for the rest of their lives. And if this is the case, and I think we have good reason to believe that it is, the disciples would have repeated the stories about Jesus numerous times. Here's Robert Stein again. "If we assume for a moment that Peter repeated a pericope every month up to the time that Mark wrote his gospel around the year 65, this would mean that he told the same account 420 times, 35 years times 12. If he told it once every week, he would have repeated it 1,820 times, 35 times 52. Surely Peter's eyewitness testimony could become quite stereotyped and generalized in such a process. The point Stein makes here is that Peter's constant retelling of Jesus' words and deeds would have cemented those things into his memory. So if the Gospel of Mark is based upon Peter's memories, well, then that gospel contains reliable memories. Number 4, the disciples were emotionally and personally involved in unusual events. There are 2 components to this point that we need to consider. The first is that the disciples were emotionally and personally involved. As every memory study indicates, those who are personally involved in an event remember the details of that event far better than others who simply heard about it. One such study compared soldiers from Denmark who were present during the German invasion during World War II with students who merely learned about it in a classroom. Years later, as they were interviewing soldiers and students, they were asked to recall what the weather was like during the time of the invasion. More than 2/3 of the soldiers could recall exactly what the memory was like, compared to only 1/20 of the students who had just learned about it in the classroom. And of course, this makes a lot of sense because those soldiers were emotionally and personally involved in those events. Now, for those of us who are married, we all remember our own weddings far better than the other weddings that we have attended because we were emotionally and personally involved in that event. Of all the weddings I've ever attended, and there's been a bunch of them, I cannot tell you all the bridesmaids and all the groomsmen that were involved. But for my wedding, I can. And for all the weddings I've attended, I can't tell you most of the officiants who perform those ceremonies, but for my wedding, I can, because I was personally and emotionally involved. I don't remember most of the baseball games I've ever watched, but I do remember certain games from when I was a child playing Little League 30 years ago. I remember specifically a time when I was 9 years old that the coach made me play catcher for his son who had never pitched before, a son that only made the team because his dad was the coach, mind you. Let's just say I got quite the workout that night. I also remember playing a game against our rival team when I was 12 years old, and I remember getting the game-winning walk-off hit. I remember this event vividly because I was personally and emotionally involved. Studies also reveal that people tend to remember unusual events, things that are out of the ordinary or the mundane. For instance, I can't remember what I ate for lunch 10 days ago, but I can remember eating haggis one time when I visited Scotland about 15 years ago. Now, if you don't know what haggis is, well, just Google it, because you can, unlike people from the ancient world. I also remember one time standing on top of the World Trade Center just over a month before they were attacked on September 11th and came crashing down. That is a memory that is forever burned in my brain because I not only had the thrill of standing on top of those towers overlooking New York City, I continued to reflect on that day a good bit after the terrorist attacks, thinking how if they had decided to come a month earlier, I would have been dead. Well, when you think about the disciples' experiences, they weren't just dispassionate people who had heard these stories passed down to them. No, they were personally and emotionally involved, and they witnessed a bunch of unusual events firsthand. I mean, imagine watching Jesus raise Lazarus from the dead. Do you suppose that if you watched that story unfold, you watched those events happen before your eyes, that you would ever forget it? Or what if you watched him multiply the loaves and fish, and he fed the 5,000? Or what if you ever watched him give sight to the blind or make the lame walk? Do you think that you would misremember those events? Of course not, because they're highly unusual. Well, going back to the Emory study, while those students forgot much of what they were doing on the day that the Challenger space shuttle exploded, suppose that the same study was conducted for members who were working at NASA that day. Or what if they conducted the study for family members of those who were killed in the explosion? Don't you suppose that they would have remembered the events better because they were emotionally and personally involved? It seems likely. And number 5, the early Christian community would have safeguarded the memories. Suppose for a moment that you tried to recall all the details from a party that you attended a few months ago. chances are you would misremember a lot of things. But suppose you got together with all the other people who were at that party and collectively you tried to recall everything that happened. Chances are you would probably get more of the facts straight. Well, with respect to the disciples, we must remember that dozens of eyewitnesses existed in the early church. Many of them had heard the same teachings and observed the same events and miracles. This network of people would have safeguarded the Jesus tradition from going off the rails. Now, to be sure, social memory or communal memory can go awry if a strong, persuasive storyteller is able to influence the group and embed a distorted memory into the whole group. Nevertheless, the network of eyewitnesses would have been a natural corrector for a story told the wrong way. Recall what I mentioned in the previous video on Kenneth Bailey's experience in the Middle Eastern villages. As the community gathered and as they sat in circles and retold the traditions from their community, if someone ever got those details wrong, the group would interrupt the storyteller and correct their mistake. Well, the same sort of accountability mechanism would have existed in the early church. Imagine if Peter stood up and told the story about the feeding of the 5,000, but when he got to the point about the boy with the loaves and the fish, he said that the boy had 12 loaves and 7 fish. Because there were dozens of other eyewitnesses to the events who knew the correct number, that it was actually 5 loaves and 2 fish, they would speak up and correct his mistake. As Dave Rubin remarks, an audience knowledgeable in a tradition is a strong conservative force that keeps the tradent, that's the person passing along the tradition, keeps the tradent within the traditional bounds by voicing its approval, by offering alternative versions it thinks are preferred, or even by providing corrections. So you see, instead of seeing the memories passed along like a chain of transmission from one individual to the next, where if one person's memory is faulty, the whole chain falls apart, it's more accurate to think of the memories being passed in a net transmission, where the rest of the community can provide support for the memory being shared. In this way, the memories could be safeguarded. So in summary, we have good reason to trust the memories of the eyewitnesses of Jesus. First, it was customary for students in the ancient world to memorize extensive portions of information. Second, the disciples would have heard Jesus retell the same things over and over again. Third, the disciples would have then retold the sayings and deeds of Jesus over and over again. Fourth, the disciples were emotionally and personally involved in unusual events. And fifth, the early Christian community would have helped safeguard those memories. In the next video, we're going to consider what kind of genre the Gospels are and how that influences the way that we think about their reliability. Thanks so much for watching. Be sure to hit like and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next video.